What seems like an innocent conversation with a stranger takes a disturbing turn.
I was gonna maybe get like a backup here, but should we make sure it's not too like sheer or clear?
Right. Do you remember running into me in the grocery store?
Who is this guy?
As a predator who has been operating for years is unmasked.
A total of 74 women have come forward.
He's not just filming you, he's streaming you.
Call the cops! Call the cops on him! Call the cops!
Then, an attempted robbery at an ATM goes haywire.
It's an all-out brawl at the ATM. Fists flying, adrenaline pumping, and a superhero Good Samaritan swinging.
This is extremely dangerous because the tables can be turned onto that person.
And that's exactly what happens.
He's not backing down. And then things go out of control.
When he turned around, that's when I saw the black box cutter. This is when I realized this situation was a whole lot more serious than what I thought it was.
Call the cops! Call the cops on him! Call the cops!
You were looking at cell phone video shot by a woman who says she was targeted by this guy.
April 26th, 2016, Yulee, Florida, 12:30 p.m. A man enters a large department store. He walks over to the personal care section and places several razors into his handheld cart. But then, just 90 seconds after entering, he approaches a young woman shopping for bathing suits.
He comes up to her and he's asking her questions. Initially, it sounds pretty innocent. He's asking for some help by shopping for his wife.
We make sure it's not too like sheer or clear.
So, she's trying to help him out.
But the man's questions quickly take a creepy turn.
He starts asking very odd things like, do you think that this will be see-through? Do you think that my wife's underwear will show? Who is this guy? Has he been following her? What is he up to? What does he want?
And there's something even more chilling. The woman realizes that she's seen this man before. And that's when she flips on her camera phone and begins to secretly record this deeply troubling encounter.
I was gonna maybe get like a backup here, but should we make sure it's not too like sheer or clear?
Right. Do you remember running into me in the grocery store?
When the man realizes the woman knows who he is, he turns and races out.
No, hey, where are you going? Come back. Hey, get this guy. Stop him. Stop this guy. Stop him. Stop that guy.
Who is this guy? Why is this woman so angry at him? And what has he done to her before?
Call the cops on him. Call the cops.
35-year-old Candace Spivey is the woman who chases after the man. 2 years earlier, he had approached her exactly the same way.
So the first time that I encountered him, I was in the grocery store. He came up to me very casually and he started talking about how it was his wife's and his anniversary. And he just bought this maxi dress. He goes, so I was kind of, wondering, should she wear like a jacket with this? He starts out very casual.
And then it's the same story. The man's questions grow increasingly personal and soon uncomfortably sexual.
He goes, well, what about her underwear? Should she wear like full underwear? And when he mentions, should she shave? My eyes started wondering and I looked into his shopping cart and I noticed that he had different types of razors for both men and women. So while he's talking to you and asking you these questions, he's holding his phone like this.
What is he doing? Creeped out, Candace walks away from the strange man in disgust. But then she sees him approach another woman.
I followed him to the next aisle and I saw him from behind, and as he's holding his phone, you could see him recording her through his phone on the other side.
Why is this guy secretly videotaping women in the store while asking them inappropriate questions? Whatever he wants, Candace knows it's wrong.
I did call the police. They kicked him out of the grocery store, reported him. Of course, he wasn't doing anything illegal. So they didn't feel there was any reason to run his information or anything.
For Candace, it's an incredibly frustrating situation. She feels violated, but it's not illegal to videotape people in public places like a grocery store, with or without their consent.
When I got in my car, I actually sat there and I cried like a baby.
So, when Candace finds herself face to face with the same man 2 years later, she's absolutely stunned.
And I'm standing there looking at bathing suits and he's on my side. And I'm like, is this really happening right now?
Do you remember running into me in the grocery store?
In my mind, not this time.
Call the cops! Call the cops on him! Call the cops! Get where he's going! No, you!
A dramatic chase out of a Target in Yulee.
April 26, 2016. The summer heat arrives early in Florida, and 35-year-old Candace Spivey wants something new to wear to the beach.
I went in to get a bathing suit. I wasn't even in there for 5 minutes before he came up to me.
A man approaches her in the swimsuit section and starts asking questions about a gift he's buying for his wife.
He goes, hi, I just bought this maxi dress for my wife and I'm just worried about it being too sheer or clear.
His questions quickly become highly suggestive and inappropriate. That's when Candace realizes this is the very same man who approached her 2 years before. And this time, she isn't going to walk away.
I had it, and I was done. Done with creeps, done with people being predators and thinking that they can just prey on women. Just done.
So, she secretly starts to record their conversation.
But should we make sure it's not too sheer or clear?
Right. Do you remember running into me in the grocery store? No, hey, where are you going? Come back. Hey.
My adrenaline was going, my nerves were going. I was not thinking, but I chased him out, not really knowing what to expect. Something about the video that nobody knows. There are about 12 Target employees behind me, running with me after him.
Get where he's going. No, you.
All I remember is how hot it was outside, how anxious I was to get an identity on him.
Follow this. No, I caught you, mother.
This was incredibly brave. Most people would say do not pursue someone who is a sexual predator. Because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what this guy's done in the past.
To Candace's frustration, the man gets away again. But store employees have already called 911. Police arrive a few minutes later and question him in a nearby parking lot. His name is Jeffrey Polizzi, a married man with, it turns out, a criminal record. He was convicted 7 years earlier in 2009 for an even more upsetting crime.
He was caught sliding his foot under changing rooms while girls were changing into bikinis. He had a camera inside of his shoe.
Back then, he was charged with video voyeurism, a criminal misdemeanor, and sentenced to 120 days in jail.
He is a video voyeur. He's not just filming you, he's streaming you. He's streaming you to a platform where multiple other people are paying to watch you unknowingly.
Candace is so furious and disgusted, she decides to take her story public and post the video she took on social media. And the response is overwhelming.
New details after this shocking video surfaced. A total of 74 women have come forward saying that Jeffrey Polizzi took photos and videos of them in dressing rooms.
The stunning number of victims underscores just how prolific this predator has been and how long he's been at it. The video gets over 2 million views, and Candace is hailed as a hero.
A lot of victims feel that they don't have justice and they're not safe until the person that's violated them is caught. She was determined to not let him get away, and she wanted to take her power back, and she did.
But when she thinks back to that day, Candace has mixed feelings about her actions.
As courageous as it was and as good as it felt, inside at that moment, it was really dumb.
Get this guy!
I could have ran out into a situation that would have ended my life. I definitely don't encourage anyone to do that because you don't know what the consequences could be. But chasing them like I did, it was one of those heat of the moment things.
Call the cops! Call the cops on him! Call the cops!
Coming up, when another brazen crime happens in a public place, Good Samaritans come to the rescue.
These two guys show up and things get even more intense. They start fighting this guy.
September 8, 2018, 7 a.m. All is quiet outside a bank in Orlando, Florida. But then, the surveillance cameras capture a man creeping around the ATM machine.
What is this guy doing? Who is he?
It's quickly obvious he's up to no good.
All of a sudden, we see this guy come out of nowhere. He lunges into the vehicle and tries to rob the driver.
A routine trip to the ATM drive-thru becomes a nightmare for the elderly couple inside the car, as the man aggressively reaches through the window for the woman's purse. To escape, the female driver takes off. But incredibly, the suspect clings to the moving car, with half his body still halfway inside the window.
This is so scary. They must be thinking, why is this guy not leaving us alone?
The driver doesn't get far. Suddenly, the car comes to an abrupt stop.
What could be going on inside this car right now? What could he be doing to this driver?
The robber is still wrestling with the driver.
There's probably a really intense struggle. Somebody's not able to drive that car away.
Then, just as the situation becomes increasingly dire, something unexpected happens.
All of a sudden, we see two men running towards the vehicle. As soon as these guys realize something bad is happening, they spring into action.
These two Good Samaritans rushed into the situation, not really thinking about how they could get hurt. They were so focused on helping someone else.
The man dressed in black yanks the robber out of the window, and he's caught off guard. The thief looks like he's going to flee the scene.
This is extremely dangerous for someone to actually confront a crime while in progress, because now all of a sudden the tables can be turned onto that person.
But then, with no warning, the suspect spins around and charges towards the two Good Samaritans. It's now an all-out brawl, and they have no choice but to defend themselves.
One of them actually goes into a boxing stance. He's ready to take this guy on.
The robber takes a giant swing at one of the men, but he gives him a swift shove, which sends the thief running behind a building.
We see them leave camera view for a second. We see one of the Good Samaritans actually kicking at the attacker. It looks like they have the upper hand at this point.
The situation seems under control at last, but that all changes in an instant. The suspect does an about-face and runs full speed towards the man in black.
This Good Samaritan did not see this coming. He must be terrified.
His name is Leon Wright, a 53-year-old businessman. And just as the angry robber tries to tackle him, Leon quickly ducks out of the way, and the suspect once again runs off.
Okay, he's gone now, so this is about to end.
But to Leon's shock, the robber doesn't make a break for it after all. Instead, he turns around and once again charges right for him.
But he's not backing down. And then things go out of control.
That's when Leon sees something in the robber's hand that terrifies him.
When he turned around, he was in the light because he was underneath the awning of the bank. And that's when I saw the black box cutter in his hand.
The man has a knife.
This is when I realized this situation was a whole lot more serious than what I thought it was.
It's an all-out brawl at the ATM. Fists flying, adrenaline pumping, and a superhero Good Samaritan swinging. He's fighting to save the lives of strangers.
At that point, everything happened fast.
After rushing to the aid of an elderly couple who were being attacked, Leon Wright is now face to face with an armed robber.
And when he turned around, that's when I saw the blade in his hand.
When Leon came to the aid of the couple in the car, he had no idea he was putting his life on the line.
I just want him to go away. That's all I wanted.
It all begins when Leon hears someone honking a horn just as he's about to enter a store.
So I was gonna ignore it and keep on going, but then the horn was blowing nonstop. So I'm like, something's wrong.
The bank back there was closed. The Walmart over here was open. Somehow, while getting attacked, this woman had the clarity to put her car in drive and start honking her horn.
At first, as he races towards the car, Leon doesn't see the robber.
The reason I couldn't see the guy as I was approaching the car is because he was waist deep in the driver's window.
But then, the man in the passenger seat catches his attention.
And that's when he let the window down. He said, "Help us."
That's the moment Leon says it all clicked.
I kind of computed it real fast. They're leaving the bank. This guy is in the car. So I knew this guy was trying to rob the people. At that point, I didn't even think. I just reacted.
Leon starts doing everything he can to get the violent robber away from the terrified elderly driver.
He was struggling with her trying to take whatever she had in her hand. He was not trying to come out of that car because he hadn't gotten what he came to get yet. I was banging in his back, so when I started pulling him, he came out the window.
That's when Leon says the robber gets angry.
So when he came out, I guess, the natural instinct, so now he wanted to defend himself. So now he came out swinging.
Even with the other Good Samaritan helping, it feels like an uneven matchup to Leon.
I'm only 5'5". This guy he had to be at least 5'11", 6 foot tall.
But when his opponent trips behind the building, Leon thinks the fight's almost over.
I was trying to kick him. I was trying to punch him while he was down. And then he got back up. So, I got rid of my boxer stand, but he started to run away. So I'm thinking, okay, this is done with.
But to Leon's surprise, the robber doesn't take the easy out and gets even more vicious.
He could have just ran through the hedges and would have disappeared into the dark. But I guess he said, before I leave, I'm gonna cut this guy or something before I leave.
With the box cutter in his hand, the robber makes one last move, charging right for Leon.
I want to get away from this blade. And that's when I tried to backpedal out of there.
Leon avoids the blade just in the nick of time, but stumbles backwards, crashing into the pavement.
I lost my footing, and I fell and I rolled over my wrist. Yeah, it was real bad.
As Leon picks himself up from the ground, the robber finally takes off for good. The couple in the car are shaken but unharmed. The other Good Samaritan, who turns out to be visiting from another state, is uninjured and calls 911. But Leon is in bad shape. He's rushed to the hospital for a broken wrist, fractured elbow, and dislocated shoulder.
I woke up, I had a cage. So I had screws and we had like a scalpel. That's when I was like, wow, I was really in danger.
Leon's wife, Tati, is shocked when she sees her husband's injuries.
When I saw the video, I realized just how blessed we were that it ended just with a broken arm.
The suspect who put Leon in the hospital managed to evade police. And to this day, he remains unidentified and at large.
The suspect has now been on the run for 6 weeks, but investigators tell me they believe he's still in the area.
Several weeks later, the elderly male victim calls Leon to thank him and reveals some shocking information. That purse the robber tried so desperately to steal, it wasn't a purse at all.
And he was telling me that that package he was trying to get was an urn. It was her sister's ashes. They came from a funeral for her sister. That's why she didn't let it go, because the bag was her sister's remains.
Word spreads about the brave actions of Leon and the other Good Samaritan, and they're recognized for their heroism.
When I was chosen as the Orange County Citizen of the Year, I got this. I received a Carnegie Hero Medal as well.
Luckily, these guys came around when they did, because if not, who knows what could have happened.
Still, law enforcement advise that for anyone who encounters a crime in progress, it's best to call 911. Leon's wife agrees.
You don't know who has a gun. You just don't know.
But she is not at all surprised her husband put his life on the line for total strangers.
Leon is so selfless. Leon is a very loving, caring person.
Leon says he's just glad he was in the right place at the right time.
If I hadn't been there at that time, I don't know, that could have ended a whole lot worse for that lady.
Really bad.
I'm able to move on and still live my life, and she's got her life. So I'm just glad it ended the way it did as opposed to the alternative.
This was an incredible chase.
It's hard to believe it's really happening.
We're watching a missile going down the street.
And this dangerous pursuit just keeps getting crazier.
There's a dog on this driver's lap.
It was like a Stephen King movie.
It was devastating to watch.
This woman is doing everything she can to get away from the police.
And coming up, another female driver and another jaw-dropping crime.
They were inside a plastic bag, all wet, sweaty, and just crying.
7 puppies that were barely a couple days old. It's despicable.
Debbie, why did you do that?
It's like a scene out of a big-budget action movie.
An RV chase ripping through the San Fernando Valley.
May 21st, 2019, 7 p.m. There's typically heavy rush hour traffic in LA's San Fernando Valley.
This is a time of day that people are coming home from work. Maybe they're going shopping, picking up the kids, going to work out.
But in an instant, a normal evening commute turns into horror on the highway.
The last thing they expect is a house on wheels to be coming barreling towards them.
This was an incredible chase. This suspect leading police through the San Fernando Valley in a motorhome.
Speeding down neighborhood streets is a 30-foot RV. Police have been in pursuit for about 10 minutes as the RV swipes parked cars, swerves around corners, and nearly runs other vehicles off the road. News choppers capture the shocking scene from the air.
And the helicopter cam is actually able to capture the enormous size of this RV. What we're watching is a missile going down the street.
The erratic driver is clocking over 70 miles per hour, and to everyone's horror, blatantly ignores every red light.
Speeding in and out of traffic, onto oncoming traffic.
It's utterly terrifying to watch as the RV flies through one intersection after another without stopping.
The driver of the RV was definitely driving erratically, and it was very unpredictable and shocking.
Who is this reckless driver, and what are they running from?
At the time of the pursuit, the information that we had was that it was a stolen vehicle.
The out-of-control RV clearly poses a lethal threat. But with a vehicle this size going this fast, traditional police tactics won't work.
During a normal pursuit with a vehicle, they use spike strips or maybe a pit maneuver. But something this size, this is going to pose extreme difficulty for law enforcement.
A pit maneuver is a technique where an officer pushes the suspect's rear bumper, forcing the fleeing car to spin sideways and stop. Spike strips are another option, which police sometimes use to bring a vehicle to an abrupt halt. But with one this large, that's quickly ruled too dangerous.
Because the size of this RV, if spike strips were laid down and the tire blew out, and now all of a sudden you have this RV careening out of control, it would be catastrophic.
Then, when the RV weaves through a parking lot, it looks as if police can close in. But when the wild driver rounds the corner, the RV smashes head-on into a palm tree.
We see the side of the RV tear open like a tin can, and that doesn't stop her. She still continues to go.
And now, half the right side has been ripped off.
The roof is collapsed in on the windshield. I don't even know how the driver could see at this point. This is beyond dangerous.
But incredibly, this reckless driver keeps going. And just when it seems the chase couldn't get wilder, the helicopter camera zooms in and catches something truly mind-boggling.
As the camera zooms in, we see something totally bizarre. It's actually a door. There's a dog on this driver's lap.
At the wheel of the speeding RV is a woman, and standing up on the broken windshield is a large dog. Somehow, the driver manages to hold on to both the dog and the wheel. A couple miles away, neighborhood resident Terry Fox watches the bizarre scene unfold on the evening news.
She was almost trying to pull the dog back into this demolished RV, and we're just watching in disbelief.
Terry is the founder of a local dog rescue, and what happens next stuns her to the core.
What happened there? What happened there? Okay, so he came to a stop.
I think the dog might have jumped out.
Right there trying to jump out the dog. No, don't jump out. Dog jumped out.
And then he jumped, and I screamed. The windows were open, and I could hear other people, oh no! We were all watching on the news around the country and holding our breath when that dog jumped out of the RV. It was devastating to watch.
Astonishingly, the dog survives the jump from the speeding RV and limps off, as the out-of-control driver keeps going on a path of seemingly endless destruction. And that's when cameras capture another jaw-dropping sight that shocks everyone.
No, look at it here. The dog is there. Another dog?
There's another dog.
This is so beyond dangerous, and you just got this feeling that this might not end well.
For 30 minutes, a Los Angeles neighborhood is terrorized by an out-of-control RV barreling through intersections with two dogs inside.
An RV chase ripping through the San Fernando Valley here. The driver of that motorhome not seeming to care about other lives or the two dogs inside.
After one of the dogs leaps from the speeding vehicle, the RV T-bones a car.
We've reached the point where this has gone from bad to worse.
How much more damage can this crazed driver cause?
We see the RV coming down the street. There's a vehicle, and it looks like he's gonna pull over and get out of her way. Then the unthinkable happens.
For 52-year-old David Opel, a married father of two, the nightmare begins when he is driving home, and out of nowhere, the RV flies into his lane.
Like, all of a sudden she was there and then cut me off. And she didn't miss me by much. Probably, maybe a couple feet. It wasn't very much.
Shaken, David pulls over to call his wife.
I said, you're not gonna believe this. Like, I almost got killed by a crazy RV. I said, it's like something out of the movie Speed.
Thankful to have avoided an accident, David gets back on the road. He notices the helicopters moving in a different direction.
And so I said, oh, okay, I guess everybody went that way. And I didn't really think about it again.
But just a few minutes later, and only a couple miles from home, David notices something that makes his blood run cold.
As I go through the stop sign, I just happen to look at my rearview mirror, and I see the RV coming up behind me. It was like a Stephen King movie, just like all of a sudden back behind me, chasing me. I was like, where did that come from? How did it get behind me?
Not only is the RV barreling right towards him, David knows he can't outrun it.
I realized she wasn't going to stop, and I needed to get off the street.
With the RV gaining momentum, David pulls into the first driveway he can, but there's a major problem.
When I started to turn into the driveway, and I noticed there was a car parked there, so I had to stop or I would have hit the car.
With nowhere to go, David is a sitting duck as the RV heads right for him.
Your brain does really weird things. I didn't close my eyes. I watched the whole thing happen. You just hear the crunch and the smashing. Still to this day, I know exactly the sound.
After plowing violently into David and then several trees, the RV finally comes to a stop.
Now she has crashed into this vehicle. You would think everything's over.
Then, unbelievably, the suspect makes a run for it on foot.
This woman is doing everything she can to get away from the police.
Finally in custody, the suspect is identified as 52-year-old Julianne Rainbird, who stole another woman's identity and credit card to purchase the RV. She is charged with 9 felonies, including cruelty to animals and assault with a dangerous weapon.
Investigators saying this is potentially a DUI case.
David is rushed to the hospital, and police assist the driver of the first crash, who is miraculously uninjured. One of the woman's dogs is taken in by Animal Services, while a volunteer rescue team searches for the other dog who leapt from the speeding RV. 4 hours later, she's finally found, alive, but with a broken paw.
Animal Services, they say those dogs are now in their care. Again, they are expected to make that full recovery.
The dogs, both female mastiffs, are placed with Terry Fox's Animal Rescue for adoption. She's immediately flooded with thousands of applicants.
All these people from across the world just messaging us.
Hundreds of miles away in Oregon, Jen and Sean Latham hear about the dogs through social media.
My reaction when I saw that, I burst into tears. I cried.
Yeah.
I just don't understand how people can do things like that to dogs.
They immediately put in a request to adopt both dogs.
We have a giant fenced backyard. We have the time. We had, everything. And I was like, they're just supposed to be with us. They're supposed to be my dogs.
But Jen and Sean must anxiously wait several weeks while their application is reviewed.
I kept thinking, this isn't going to happen. These dogs are in LA. They're going to find homes for these dogs.
Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, David spends nearly a week in the hospital for severe injuries, including a fractured back.
I had 5 broken ribs, punctured lung, and I'm still dealing with some shoulder problems because of the impact.
Along with enduring months of physical therapy, David continues to deal with emotional scars.
The PTSD is pretty severe, so it doesn't help that I drive past that driveway very often. It's right down the bottom of my street, so I pass the accident scene regularly. So that's not easy.
Julianne Rainbird, who is awaiting trial, has never explained why she was driving so recklessly that day. But David is still angry that she endangered so many lives.
She had a lot of choices. Every time she went through an intersection, she had a choice to stop. She didn't. And for that, she needs to be punished.
As for the 2 dogs, named Onyx and Starlet, they're now part of Jen and Sean's family.
And we are just so happy that they got to go from such a horrific experience to one that was so loving.
Our dining room table now is a dog kennel. Nothing doesn't have slobber or drool on it, or slobber or dog hair, but it's like, I don't think that our household has ever been happier. They run and they jump on the trampoline.
Knowing where they came from, it's rewarding for us. They're our babies now. They're part of the family.
We love them.
Yeah.
And coming up, another unthinkable act of animal cruelty.
People were just like, you gotta be kidding me. The footage itself is shocking, made us shake our heads just terribly.
At first, it looks like something people do every day.
You would think that she's tossing just some coffee cups, some trash.
April 18th, 2019, Coachella, California, the desert town best known for its popular music and arts festival. Temperatures here can be deadly.
It was about 98, almost 100 degrees.
And if security cameras at this auto parts store hadn't captured the shocking scene, it would be hard to believe. Just after 1 p.m., a white Jeep pulls up in the parking lot behind the store. With the car still running, a woman jumps out, peers into a dumpster used for recyclables, then moves to the next one.
It just drove up to the dumpsters and nonchalantly tossed what appeared to be a bag of something.
The woman quickly drives off. 16 minutes later, a man starts rummaging through the trash.
We have people who dig through the trash to get cans and, recycles and stuff. He's walking around, you can see he hears something, like he hears a noise, and then he's digging, trying to figure out where the noise is coming from.
The man picks up the clear bag the woman has just dumped and is stunned. Inside, a litter of terrified puppies.
7 puppies that were barely a couple days old, if even that.
They were inside a plastic bag, all wet, sweaty, and just crying.
The bag was sealed. They were tied in a plastic bag, dumped in the trash. I mean, it's despicable.
She came in her Jeep and she just tossed them like they were rags.
The man is so shocked. At first, he isn't sure what to do.
He puts them back down and then he walks away, but then he goes back and gets the bag and then he puts them in the corner where the other guy found them.
15 minutes later, a customer heading into the store spots the bag.
He went right into the store and said, "Hey guys, do you know you have a bag of puppies outside your store?"
While the man calls animal control for help, store employees bring the terrier mix puppies inside, out of the scorching heat.
Everybody was just devastated. They probably would have suffocated.
Just to see that was so heartbreaking. We don't really know how long they were in that bag prior to those 30 minutes that they were here.
Investigators plead with the public to take a close look at the surveillance video.
The search continues for the woman who faces felony animal cruelty charges. If you recognize her, call the Riverside Sheriff's Department.
Who is she, and why did she do this? The shocking video sparks intense anger.
Throwing 7 newborn puppies into a garbage heap.
She was trying to conceal the puppies.
Oh, they just couldn't believe that somebody would do that to poor innocent puppies.
But it was caught on tape. It shocked the world. This was 7 living creatures.
On social media, people call the woman a monster, and everyone wants authorities to find her.
People equate it to just like children. You know, they're innocent, they don't have a voice of their own. We're responsible to take care of them, and she chose to put them in a bag, which was disgusting, and throw them in the trash and discard them like garbage.
And that disgust only escalates when, 3 days after the puppies are found, the story takes a tragic turn.
One of the puppies that was tossed into a Coachella dumpster, then rescued, has died.
That really touched the nerve of people.
We just wanted justice for those puppies.
After 7 newborn puppies are rescued from a dumpster, they're rushed to a shelter. Their condition is delicate. They are so small they are palm-sized and have to be fed with bottles. But they respond quickly, and the shelter shares photos of them as they open their eyes for the first time. But after a few days, there's a heartbreaking development.
One of the puppies did actually perish, so there's only 6 puppies that are alive. But I mean, certainly considering that they were tied in a plastic bag, dumped in the trash, temperatures are 90 degrees plus, the fact that 6 survived is probably a minor miracle.
Still, the case infuriates people, and people are eager to do whatever they can to help. At the auto parts store where they were dumped, the phone rings non-stop.
We started getting a lot of calls. We wanted to donate money, clothes, sweaters, and little shirts, pillows, food. I mean, anything you could think of, they brought.
And everyone is anxious for investigators to find the woman who did this.
A lot of people called in, gave us tips.
One thing is certain. She seemed to have no idea there were surveillance cameras at the site.
You're at a business. There's going to be cameras everywhere.
Napa had some great camera angles. The images of the white Jeep are quite clear. The license plate was pretty clear.
It only takes investigators a few days to figure out who she is. A 54-year-old local woman named Deborah Colwell, and they head straight to her home.
The suspect exited her residence, so I got out of the vehicle, confronted her, placed her under arrest in her handcuffs.
Breaking news, an arrest in a puppy dumping case caught on camera in Coachella.
Debbie, why did you do that? Why would you throw those puppies away like trash?
Deborah says nothing to reporters, but admits to investigators that she is the woman in the video.
She seemed like the jig was up, I think, because of all the publicity over the weekend. It was just kind of like, yeah, I did it. Here I am. Let's get this over with.
But why? What investigators discover next is even more shocking.
The house was full of dogs.
38 of them.
Damn, you have 38 more dogs? It was just disgusting.
So you had dogs hiding in little nooks and crannies. Just sad. I mean, just real sad. You just can't have dozens of dogs inside a cramped single-family home. It's not healthy.
Colwell doesn't offer much of an explanation, except to say it all started with a few dogs, but then they began breeding and things got out of hand.
She said she just felt overwhelmed, and she said that she didn't want to turn them into the shelter. She did have priors. She did have an arrest record with drug charges and such.
People are so furious about the puppy dumping, a petition is circulated urging prosecutors to give Colwell the maximum penalty on the charges she faces.
7 charges, felony counts for animal cruelty, and 7 misdemeanor counts for abandoning animals.
Then, at a bail hearing in June 2019, her attorney manages to make people even angrier.
Puppies aren't people. They're not people. People were just like, you got to be kidding me. No, this was 7 living creatures tossed like garbage. That's the part that has transcended around the world. People can't fathom that somebody would be so cruel.
Colwell never goes to trial. Instead, after initially pleading not guilty, on August 14th, she pleads guilty to all charges.
She got 365 days in county jail, a myriad of probation conditions, such as not owning any animals for the duration of her probation, which ends in 2026.
With credit for time served, Colwell actually serves 174 days. She is also ordered to undergo random drug testing and get mental health counseling.
I just want to ask, like, why? Why would you do that? You have no heart whatsoever.
As for the puppies, for the 6 who did survive, there's a happy ending. They've all been adopted.
They're very healthy, and they've turned into some really cute little doggies.
Those are strong little puppies.
All of the other 38 dogs found in Colwell's house were also adopted.
What she did was wrong. I hope she realizes what she did.
In this day and age, there's no need to do that. You have alternatives. There are so many nonprofit rescue organizations that will help people. These puppies survived because they were good people and a lot of great kindness by a lot of strangers, all doing the right thing for animals that need it. So there is redemption, of course, in what we believe to be one of the most despicable acts of alleged animal cruelty that we've ever seen.
There are crimes that are solved by fingerprints, others by DNA. Some are unraveled because a witness finally finds the courage to speak. But every so often, there's a case that survives for years without any of those things, a mystery held together by silence, speculation, and the complete absence of certainty. This is one of those cases. It begins in northern Italy, in the quiet city of Parma, in the summer of 1989. It ends, unexpectedly, nearly a decade later, not in a courtroom or a police station, but in front of a television camera in London. Between those two moments lies one of the most extraordinary criminal investigations in modern Italian history, a story in which an entire family vanished without a trace, leaving behind no bodies, no obvious crime scene, and no clear explanation, until the man everyone believed had also disappeared calmly admitted that he had killed them all. For almost 9 years, the Caretta family seemed to have simply dissolved into thin air. Giuseppe Caretta, a meticulous accountant, his wife, Marta Chetzi, a homemaker, their younger son, Nicola, who had struggled with drug addiction but was trying to rebuild his life, and Ferdinando Caretta, the eldest son, who at 27 still lived with his parents. One day they were there, then they were gone. Their apartment stood empty. Their neighbors saw no signs of violence. There were no cries for help, no reports of gunfire that triggered an emergency response. No witnesses describing suspicious strangers entering or leaving the building. It was as if an ordinary Italian family had quietly packed their belongings and left behind there. Old life. Yet even that explanation quickly began to fall apart. Families do not normally disappear without telling relatives. They do not abandon homes, possessions, routines, and personal relationships without leaving behind some explanation. As weeks turned into months and months into years, questions multiplied while answers remained painfully scarce. Investigators searched for clues that might point toward financial problems, hidden enemies, or plans to emigrate. The public filled the silence with theories of its own. Perhaps Giuseppe had embezzled money from his employer and fled the country with his family before authorities could catch him. Perhaps they had started over somewhere in the Caribbean. Barbados became one rumored destination. Venezuela became another. Others believed organized crime had intervened. Some whispered about the mafia. Others imagined international conspiracies. Every new rumor briefly promised a breakthrough before collapsing under the weight of missing evidence. The longer the mystery endured, the more impossible it seemed to solve. The Coretta case became something larger than a local investigation. It evolved into one of Italy's most enduring missing family mysteries, discussed in newspapers, debated on television, and remembered by ordinary citizens who wondered how 4 people could vanish so completely. Throughout those years, one television program played an especially important role in keeping the case alive. Chi l'ha visto, translated into English as Who Has Seen Them, had become one of Italy's best-known investigative broadcasts dedicated to missing persons. Episode after episode revisited disappearances that had grown cold, hoping that a forgotten witness or a small overlooked detail might reignite an investigation. The Coretta family appeared more than once. Millions of viewers watched appeals for information. Tips arrived from across Italy and beyond. In November 1989, only months after the disappearance, one viewer contacted the program to report that the family's camper vehicle had been found parked in Milan. Police examined it carefully, hoping they had finally discovered the first meaningful clue. Instead, they found very little. The vehicle belonged to the Coretta family, but it offered almost nothing that could explain where they had gone. Inside, investigators recovered almost no significant evidence beyond a local newspaper. The discovery solved nothing. If anything, it deepened the mystery. Why would a family abandon their vehicle hundreds of kilometers from home? Had someone else driven it there? Had the family boarded a plane? Had they crossed a border? Every answer seemed to generate even more questions. Years passed. Leads dried up. Witness reports became increasingly unreliable. People claimed they had seen members of the Coretta family in different countries. One person believed they were living in the Caribbean. Another insisted they had settled somewhere in South America. None of those reports could ever be confirmed. Each false lead demanded time and resources, pulling investigators farther away from the truth instead of closer to it. Meanwhile, one member of the family was quietly building an entirely different life. Ferdinando Coretta had left Italy and settled in London. Remarkably, he did not adopt a false identity. He did not disappear into an elaborate criminal network. He did not construct a sophisticated new persona. According to later investigations, he simply lived under his own name. He rented inexpensive accommodations. He worked occasional jobs, including delivery work. At times he relied on unemployment benefits. Those who encountered him described a quiet, reserved man who rarely spoke about his family or his past. There was nothing outwardly dramatic about his life. There is certainly nothing that suggested he was connected to one of Italy's most puzzling missing person cases. It is difficult to overstate how extraordinary that fact would later appear. While police searched across borders, considered organized crime, investigated financial motives, and followed rumors stretching across continents, the central figure in the mystery was living openly under his real name. Sometimes the greatest disguise is not a false identity, but the assumption that no one would hide in plain sight. Then came November 1998. Not a spectacular raid, not a dramatic chase, not an anonymous letter, just an ordinary document check conducted by British police. During that routine encounter, an officer recognized the name Ferdinando Coretta as matching records connected to the long unsolved disappearance in Italy. Information moved from local authorities to Scotland Yard, then through Interpol, and finally back to Italian investigators. For the first time in nearly 9 years, the investigation had found someone who might finally explain what had happened to the missing family. Initially, Ferdinando maintained the same story that had circulated for years. He claimed that his parents and brother had traveled to the Caribbean and that he no longer knew where they were. It was a familiar explanation, one that echoed many of the rumors investigators had already examined without success. But events were about to take an astonishing turn, one unlike almost anything seen in modern criminal investigations. Reporters from Chi El Ha Visto, traveled to London to interview him. They expected another denial, another vague explanation. Perhaps another dead end in a mystery that had already consumed nearly a decade. Instead, something almost unimaginable happened. Before television cameras, Ferdinando Correda calmly admitted that there had never been any disappearance. There had been no escape to the Caribbean, no financial exile, no organized crime conspiracy. He stated simply that he had picked up a gun and shot his father, his mother, and his brother. In a single confession, nearly 9 years of speculation collapsed. Yet even then, the mystery did not truly end. There were still no bodies. The murder weapon had never been recovered. The alleged crime scene had long since been cleaned. Investigators still had to determine whether the confession matched physical evidence that barely existed. They would return to Parma, reopen the apartment, excavate a landfill, and reconstruct a crime that had left remarkably little behind. What emerged was not only the story of a familicide, but also the story of an investigation shaped as much by absence as by evidence, a case where silence became its own form of deception, where an entire nation searched for missing people who had, according to the man who confessed, never left home alive. This is the story of the Correda family, a story about disappearance, confession, and the unsettling realization that sometimes the greatest mystery is not how someone vanishes, but how the truth can remain hidden in plain sight for almost a decade. Before the Correda family became the center of one of Italy's most perplexing criminal investigations, they were, to almost everyone who knew them, simply another family living an ordinary life in Parma. There was nothing about their address, their routines, or their place in the community that hinted they would one day become the subject of nationwide television programs. Endless newspaper headlines and years of unanswered questions. Their story did not begin with violence. It began with normality, or at least with the appearance of it. That appearance would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Because when investigators eventually looked back, they discovered very little that clearly warned of the catastrophe waiting inside the apartment on Via Rimini. Parma, located in Italy's Emilia-Romagna region, is a city known for its history, culture, and industry. It is a place where daily life often follows familiar rhythms, where neighborhoods become communities, and where unusual events rarely escape public attention. In 1989, the Correda family lived in an apartment at 8 Via Rimini. It was not an isolated home hidden from view, but part of an ordinary residential setting. Neighbors recognized one another. People noticed when someone left for vacation or when lights remained off for unusually long periods. Yet even in such an environment, what happened inside the Correda home remained concealed long enough for one of Italy's greatest mysteries to take shape. The head of the household was Giuseppe Correda. He worked as an accountant for a company involved in the glass manufacturing industry, a profession that reflected precision, discipline, and responsibility. Those who knew him described him as methodical and serious, someone who approached both work and family with a structured mindset. Colleagues reportedly regarded him as careful and dependable, qualities expected of someone entrusted with financial responsibilities. Within the family, however, later testimony painted a more complicated picture. According to Ferdinando's own account years after the murders, Giuseppe was an authoritarian father who frequently criticized his eldest son and maintained strict control over family decisions. It is important to distinguish, however, between perception and evidence. While Ferdinando described feeling constantly judged and pressured by his father, investigators found no evidence of severe physical abuse or sustained violence within the household that could independently explain the murders. This distinction would become significant during both the investigation and the later legal proceedings. Giuseppe's personality, may have contributed to tensions inside the family. But the available evidence did not support the conclusion that the household was defined by brutality. Alongside Giuseppe was his wife, Marta Chetzi. Unlike her husband, whose professional life placed him outside the home, Marta dedicated herself primarily to caring for the family. She managed the daily routines of domestic life and represented the steady presence within the apartment. Compared to the attention later focused on Giuseppe and Ferdinando, relatively little entered the public record regarding Marta's personal life. She appeared instead through the memories of those around her, as a mother, a wife, and a homemaker whose ordinary existence ended without warning. Like the other victims, she would never receive the dignity of a proper recovery or burial because her remains have never been found. The younger son, Nicola Caretta, carried his own personal struggles. At some point before 1989, he had battled heroin addiction, a challenge that had affected many families across Europe during that era. Yet by the time of the murders, Nicola was reportedly attempting to rebuild his life. Recovery is rarely a straight path, and while his earlier addiction formed part of the family's history, available information suggests he was working toward stability rather than descending deeper into crisis. His efforts to move beyond that difficult chapter make his death especially tragic. Whatever challenges he had faced, they ended not through relapse or illness, but through an act of violence committed inside his own home. Then there was Ferdinando Caretta, the eldest son and, years later, the admitted killer. In 1989, he was 27 years old. Unlike many people his age who had established independent careers or households, Ferdinando still lived with his parents. According to investigative records, he struggled to maintain stable employment and experienced difficulty building an independent life. He had relatively few friends and lived a quiet, introverted existence. Those characteristics, by themselves, are neither unusual nor predictive of violence. Countless people live reserved lives while facing employment difficulties, and they never harm anyone. That reality is essential to remember because hindsight can easily tempt observers into seeing warning signs that were neither obvious nor meaningful at the time. Before August 1989, there was no public indication that Ferdinando would become responsible for a triple homicide. Neighbors did not describe explosive outbursts that suggested imminent danger. There were no known public incidents that foreshadowed the destruction of his family. Instead, what emerged after the confession was the portrait of a man whose internal struggles had remained largely invisible to those around him. Years later, during psychiatric evaluations conducted after his arrest, specialists concluded that Ferdinando suffered from serious mental illness at the time of the murders. Their assessments described distorted thinking regarding family relationships, persistent feelings of being controlled and oppressed, and paranoid tendencies. Those findings would eventually shape the outcome of his trial. Yet they also illustrate a difficult truth frequently encountered in criminal investigations involving mental illness. The existence of psychological disorders often becomes fully understood only after irreversible tragedy has already occurred. Prior to the crimes, the public record contains no indication that authorities or the community recognize Ferdinando as someone likely to commit mass violence. This does not diminish the significance of his later diagnosis, but it reminds us that the warning signs were far less obvious than they may appear when viewed through the lens of hindsight. At the center of the household was an increasingly strained relationship between father and son. According to Ferdinando's later statements, he believed Giuseppe constantly criticized him, questioned his inability to maintain steady employment, and exercised excessive control over family life. Ferdinando claimed these repeated confrontations left him feeling trapped and without a future. Such perceptions became central to his explanation of what eventually happened. Investigators, however, approached those claims with caution. They acknowledged the existence of domestic tension, but found no independent evidence supporting severe abuse. Many families experience arguments over employment, finances, expectations, or adulthood. Such conflicts, while emotionally painful, do not ordinarily culminate in murder. The challenge facing investigators was to understand how familiar domestic disagreements could exist, alongside an act of violence so extreme that it erased an entire family. It is a question that still lingers around the case today because no simple answer fully bridges the gap between conflict and catastrophe. As the summer of 1989 progressed, nothing publicly suggested that the Coretta household stood on the edge of irreversible disaster. The apartment on Via Rimini remained an ordinary home occupied by an ordinary family. Giuseppe continued his professional responsibilities. Marta maintained the household. Nicola pursued a more stable life after his earlier struggles. Ferdinando remained under the same roof, carrying frustrations that few outside the family fully understood. From the outside, life appeared to continue much as it always had. Yet beneath that appearance, according to Ferdinando's later account, resentment had been growing. At some point before the murders, those emotions evolved into preparation. This distinction is critical. The evidence later showed that the killings were not the result of a sudden argument escalating. Unexpectedly, before the night of August 4th, Ferdinando traveled to Reggio Emilia, where he purchased a Walther pistol chambered in 6.35 millimeters along with ammunition. That purchase demonstrated planning. Whatever emotions had developed inside the family, the acquisition of the weapon represented a deliberate step that transformed anger into potential action. Years later, Ferdinando claimed that his original intention had been to kill only his father. According to his confession, his mother and brother became victims because they witnessed what had happened. Whether that explanation fully reflects his original intentions remains impossible to verify with certainty, particularly because neither the victims nor any eyewitnesses survived to offer their own accounts. Nevertheless, it remains the explanation contained within his confession and forms part of the factual record surrounding the case. Looking back, investigators would examine every available detail in search of earlier warning signs. They studied family dynamics, employment history, financial circumstances, and psychiatric evaluations. Yet the unsettling conclusion remained that the Coretta family had appeared remarkably ordinary, until the moment they vanished. There were disagreements, disappointments, and personal struggles, but nothing that clearly predicted the complete destruction of the household. Perhaps that is one reason the case continues to resonate decades later. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some tragedies develop quietly, hidden beneath routines that appear completely familiar. Doors open and close. Meals are prepared. Conversations are held. Neighbors exchange greetings. Life continues with reassuring regularity until suddenly it does not. By the beginning of August 1989, the Coretta family still looked from the outside like countless other families across northern Italy. Inside the apartment, however, events had already begun moving toward a conclusion from which there would be no return. A firearm had been purchased. A decision had been made. Within a matter of days, 3 lives would end. 1 man would disappear. And Italy would begin searching for a family that, according to the confession delivered nearly a decade later, had never left their home alive. By the beginning of August 1989, whatever thoughts had been building inside Ferdinando Coretta's mind had already moved beyond anger or frustration. According to the evidence established later and to his own confession, preparation had already taken place. This was not a spontaneous act born from a single argument. Before the killings, Ferdinando traveled to Reggio Emilia, where he purchased a Walther pistol chambered in 6.35 millimeters along with ammunition. That journey would later become one of the most significant details in reconstructing the crime, because it demonstrated planning. A weapon had been acquired before any shots were fired. Years later, Ferdinando would claim that his original intention was to kill only his father. According to his account, everything that followed happened because his mother and younger brother became witnesses. Whether that explanation represented the complete truth could never be independently verified. No eyewitness survived. No bodies were ever recovered. The only surviving narrative of what occurred inside the apartment came from the man who admitted carrying out the killings. Even so, investigators found enough physical evidence to conclude that his confession was consistent with what remained inside the apartment. The date was August 4th, 1989. Outside, Parma experienced another ordinary summer day. Residents continued with familiar routines, unaware that inside an apartment on Via Rimini, an entire family was approaching its final hours together. There are no verified records describing the conversations that took place inside the home that day. There are no surviving diaries, recordings, or witnesses capable of reconstructing the family's final interactions. That silence has become one of the defining characteristics of the Caretta case. Unlike many criminal investigations that include eyewitness testimony or emergency calls, this story enters its darkest chapter almost entirely through later forensic reconstruction and Ferdinando's own admission. According to his confession, Giuseppe Caretta became the first victim. At some point inside the apartment, Ferdinando drew the Walther pistol and shot his father. The available evidence does not establish a prolonged confrontation or struggle beforehand. It simply establishes that Giuseppe was the first person killed. The man who had spent years working as an accountant, who had built his life around routine and responsibility, died inside the home where he had expected safety. Whatever disagreements had existed between father and son, they ended in irreversible violence. Years later, Ferdinando described his father as the intended target of the attack. He portrayed years of criticism, control, and emotional pressure as the background to his decision. Investigators acknowledged that tensions had existed within the household, but they also emphasized that no evidence of severe physical abuse had emerged during the investigation. That distinction remains important because it reminds us that domestic conflict, however painful, does not by itself explain or justify murder. Once Giuseppe had been shot, the situation inside the apartment changed instantly. According to Ferdinando's later account, his mother, Marta Chetzi, became aware that something terrible had happened. Fearing that she would identify him or contact authorities, he shot her as well. Like her husband, Marta's life ended inside the home she had devoted herself to maintaining. She had not become involved in a confrontation. According to the confession, she became a victim because she witnessed the aftermath of the first shooting. The speed with which the violence expanded from one victim to another illustrates how rapidly a planned attack against a single individual became the destruction of an entire family. Nicola Caretta was the last to die. According to Ferdinando's statement, his younger brother also became a witness to the killings. He later claimed that this was why Nicola was shot. Only months earlier, Nicola had been trying to move forward from his earlier struggle with heroin addiction. Whatever hopes he may have carried for rebuilding his future disappeared inside the apartment on that August day. With his death, 3 members of the Caretta family were gone. The entire sequence, according to the available evidence, unfolded within a relatively short period of time. There was no prolonged siege, no hours-long confrontation, and no opportunity for outside intervention. Once the shooting ended, silence returned to the apartment. For many offenders, the moments immediately following a homicide are marked by panic, confusion, or impulsive decisions. The Caretta case unfolded differently. According to the subsequent investigation and Ferdinando's own confession, he remained sufficiently composed to begin eliminating evidence almost immediately. The killings themselves represented only the first stage of what would become a remarkably successful effort to conceal the crime. Inside the apartment, Ferdinando moved the bodies into the bathroom. That detail would later prove crucial because it corresponded with the forensic evidence discovered. Years afterward, transporting 3 bodies within a confined apartment required deliberate effort. After placing them in the bathroom, he began cleaning. Blood was washed from surfaces. Floors were scrubbed. Visible traces of violence were removed as thoroughly as possible. Clothing was changed. Every available indication suggests that considerable time was devoted to transforming a murder scene into what appeared to be an ordinary apartment. The effectiveness of that cleaning operation became apparent almost immediately once investigators first entered the residence. They found no obvious signs of a triple homicide. There were no bodies waiting to be discovered. No large pools of blood remained visible. Nothing immediately indicated that 3 people had been killed there. Years later, forensic specialists would return with more advanced techniques and locate microscopic traces of blood and DNA beneath a soap holder in the bathroom. Findings consistent with Ferdinando's description that the bodies had been temporarily placed there before being removed. But in August 1989, those tiny traces remained hidden beneath an apparently clean environment. Once the apartment had been cleaned, Ferdinando faced another problem. 3 bodies still remained inside the home. According to his confession, he waited until the following day before transporting them. One by one, the victims were loaded into a vehicle. The exact logistics of that process remain unknown because no witnesses observed it and no surveillance recordings exist from that period. What investigators do know comes from Ferdinando's own account. He stated that he drove toward the Viarolo landfill near Parma. At the landfill, according to his confession, he disposed of the bodies among the waste. At the time, this decision may have seemed practical from the killer's perspective. Years later, it would become one of the greatest obstacles facing investigators. Modern landfills receive enormous quantities of refuse every day. Once material has been buried beneath successive layers of waste, recovering specific items becomes extraordinarily difficult. By the time authorities reopened the investigation after the confession in 1998, millions of tons of garbage had accumulated over the original disposal site. Despite extensive searches, no human remains belonging to Giuseppe, Marta, or Nicola Caretta were ever recovered. Their disappearance remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Families often find some measure of closure through the recovery and burial of loved ones. In this investigation, that opportunity never came. Equally significant was the disappearance of the murder weapon. Ferdinando admitted purchasing and using the Walther pistol, yet authorities never recovered it. Without the firearm, investigators could not perform ballistic examinations or directly connect bullets to the weapon itself. Once again, the investigation depended heavily upon confession supported by limited forensic evidence rather than complete physical reconstruction. The concealment did not end with the disposal of the bodies. Ferdinando understood that 3 missing people would eventually attract attention unless their disappearance appeared voluntary. According to investigators, he therefore began constructing an alternative explanation before anyone even realized the family had vanished. He forged his father's signature and withdrew approximately 5 million lire from Giuseppe's account. He also withdrew money from Nicola's bank account. These financial activities helped create the illusion that members of the household were still alive, or at least that someone had lawful access to their finances. He continued certain routine financial transactions, further reinforcing the impression that nothing extraordinary had occurred. The next step involved the family's camper vehicle. Rather than leaving it near the apartment, Ferdinando drove it to Milan and abandoned it in a parking area. That decision would later influence the entire direction of the investigation. When the vehicle was eventually discovered after a viewer contacted the television program Cielha Visto, investigators naturally interpreted it as evidence that the family had traveled. The abandoned camper became one of the strongest reasons to consider voluntary disappearance rather than homicide. Looking back, it represented an effective piece of deception. After eliminating the most immediate evidence inside the apartment, disposing of the bodies, manipulating financial records, and abandoning the camper, Ferdinando left Italy for England. The timing of his departure completed the illusion. From the perspective of investigators in 1989, every visible fact seemed compatible with a family that had chosen to disappear. There was no confirmed murder scene, no bodies, no weapon, no confession, no eyewitnesses. Only an empty apartment, an abandoned camper, scattered financial activity, and 4 people who appear to have vanished together. In reality, according to the confession that would emerge nearly 9 years later, only one member of the family had left Italy alive. The others had never crossed a border. They had never boarded a ship or airplane. They had never begun new lives in Barbados, Venezuela, or anywhere else imagined during years of speculation. Their journey had ended inside their own home before being hidden beneath the immense landscape of a landfill. Yet none of that was known in 1989. Instead, Italy entered one of its longest-running missing family investigations, unaware that the person capable of answering every question had already disappeared across the English Channel, carrying the only complete account of what had happened inside Apartment 8 on Via Rimini. The murders themselves occupied only a brief span of time. The mystery they created would endure for nearly a decade, growing more complicated with every passing year until it was finally shattered not by a forgotten piece of evidence, but by the calm and unexpected confession of the man who had spent 9 years allowing the world to search for people he already knew would never be found. When Ferdinando Carretta left Italy after the murders, he carried with him something no investigator possessed, the complete truth. Everyone else had only fragments. An empty apartment, a family that had vanished, a camper discovered hundreds of kilometers away, bank activity that suggested life continued after the disappearance. None of those pieces naturally formed the picture of a triple homicide. Instead, they pointed investigators in almost every direction except the correct one. Looking back, the investigation into the Carretta family illustrates how thoroughly a carefully staged disappearance can distort an inquiry when the most essential element, the victims themselves, is missing. In the days and weeks following the family's disappearance, concern gradually spread through their neighborhood in Parma. Families have routines. They appear at familiar places. They speak with relatives. They shop, work, and maintain countless ordinary habits that become noticeable only when they suddenly stop. As time passed, the absence of the Carretta family became increasingly difficult to ignore. Eventually, authorities began examining what had happened. Their first destination was naturally the family's apartment at 8 Via Rimini. Investigators entered expecting to find some explanation for why 4 people had disappeared. Instead, they found uncertainty. The apartment did not resemble the aftermath of a violent crime. There were no bodies waiting to be discovered. There were no obvious pools of blood or signs of a desperate struggle. There was no evidence that strangers had forced their way inside. In many homicide investigations, detectives begin by reconstructing violence from the physical environment. Here, that environment appeared almost deceptively ordinary. The careful cleaning described later in Ferdinando's confession had accomplished exactly what it was intended to accomplish. The most visible traces of the murders had disappeared. That absence shaped every decision investigators made during the early stages of the inquiry. Because no clear crime scene existed, detectives had to consider every possible explanation. Perhaps the family had left voluntarily. Perhaps financial difficulties had forced them to disappear. Perhaps something had happened after they departed Parma, without physical evidence proving otherwise. None of those possibilities could immediately be dismissed. Then another development complicated the picture even further. In November 1989, the well-known Italian television program Chi El Ha Visto, dedicated to missing persons, continued broadcasting appeals related to the Caretta family. The program had already earned a reputation for generating valuable public tips in difficult investigations. And producers hoped someone might recognize either the missing family or something connected to their disappearance. During one broadcast, a viewer contacted the program with information that appeared significant. The caller reported seeing the Caretta family's camper parked in Milan. Police responded quickly. The vehicle was located exactly where the caller had described. Investigators examined it carefully, hoping that after months of uncertainty, they had finally found evidence capable of changing the direction of the case. Yet once again, expectations collided with disappointment. The camper unquestionably belonged to the Caretta family, but it revealed almost nothing about where its owners had gone. Inside, investigators found very little of investigative value beyond a local newspaper. There were no bodies, no obvious forensic evidence explaining the family's disappearance, no documents revealing travel plans. The discovery answered one question while creating several new ones. The family vehicle had reached Milan, but where had the family gone after that? At the time, the abandoned camper strengthened the impression that the Carettas had traveled voluntarily. Vehicles abandoned near transportation hubs often suggest onward travel by train, airplane, or ferry, combined with the absence of violence inside the apartment. Investigators now possessed multiple pieces of evidence pointing toward disappearance rather than murder. In reality, as later revealed, the camper had been deliberately placed there by Ferdinando as part of his deception. But without knowing that, police understandably incorporated it into their working theories. As months became years, the investigation expanded far beyond Parma. With almost no physical evidence to anchor the inquiry, speculation flourished. One theory suggested that Giuseppe Caretta had committed financial misconduct involving his employer and had fled Italy with his family before legal consequences could follow. Another proposed that the entire family had relocated somewhere in the Caribbean. Barbados became one of the destinations repeatedly mentioned. Venezuela emerged as another possibility. Reports arrived claiming sightings in various countries, each offering hope that the mystery might finally end. Every report required attention because investigators could not simply ignore information involving from missing people. Unfortunately, nearly all of those leads dissolved upon closer examination. None could be verified. None produced reliable evidence that the Caretta family remained alive. Another explanation attracted attention because of Italy's complicated criminal history during the late 20th century. Some observers speculated that organized crime might have been responsible. If the family had become entangled with criminal organizations, perhaps they had been abducted or murdered elsewhere. The mafia entered public discussion despite the lack of direct evidence connecting the family to organized crime. Such theories reflected the uncertainty surrounding the investigation more than any established facts. When evidence is scarce, even unlikely possibilities sometimes remain alive simply because nothing stronger replaces them. This growing collection of contradictory theories gradually transformed the Caretta case into one of Italy's best-known missing family mysteries. Newspapers revisited the disappearance. Television audiences continued following developments. Each anniversary revived public interest. Yet despite years of investigation, authorities remained no closer to finding Giuseppe Marta, Nicola, or Ferdinando. Unknown to everyone searching, one member of the family had been living an entirely different life outside Italy. After leaving his home country, Ferdinando settled in London. What makes this chapter particularly remarkable is not the sophistication of his escape, but its simplicity. He did not assume a false identity. He did not construct elaborate forged documents. He continued using his real name. According to later reports, he lived in inexpensive housing, accepted delivery work as a Pony Express courier, performed various temporary jobs, and at times relied upon unemployment benefits. People who knew him in London described someone quiet and reserved. He rarely discussed his past. He revealed almost nothing about his family. To acquaintances, he appeared to be simply another immigrant trying to build a modest life in a large city. It is one of the great ironies of the case that while Italian investigators searched internationally for an entire missing family, the admitted killer lived openly under his own identity for nearly 9 years. That extraordinary period finally came to an end in November 1998. The breakthrough arrived not through advanced forensic science, undercover surveillance, or an anonymous confession sent to police. Instead, it emerged during what should have been a completely ordinary administrative encounter. During a routine document check in London, a police officer recognized the name Ferdinando Carretta as matching records connected to the long-unsolved disappearance in Italy. What followed demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in criminal investigations. Information moved from British authorities to Scotland Yard. From there, it reached Interpol, allowing communication with Italian investigators who had spent nearly a decade searching for answers. Suddenly, after years of uncertainty, police had direct contact with the one surviving member of the missing family. Initial questioning, however, produced no immediate breakthrough. Ferdinando repeated a familiar explanation. According to him, his parents and brother had traveled to the Caribbean. He claimed he no longer knew where they were. In many respects, his statement reflected the same rumors investigators had already examined for years. Had events ended there, the mystery might have continued even longer. But another participant in the story was about to change everything. Journalists from Chi El Visto traveled to London hoping to interview the man whose name had suddenly reappeared after nearly a decade. The program had followed the Carretta disappearance for years. Producers expected an opportunity to question Ferdinando about his missing relatives, perhaps exposing inconsistencies or encouraging further investigation. What happened instead exceeded every expectation. During the interview, Ferdinando abandoned the story he had previously repeated. Calmly, without dramatic hesitation, he admitted that the disappearance had never been a disappearance at all. He stated that he had taken a gun and shot his father, his mother, and his younger brother. The confession stunned everyone involved. Journalists had expected denials. Investigators expected lengthy interrogations before uncovering the truth. Instead, one of Italy's longest-running mysteries effectively collapsed in front of a television camera. Particularly extraordinary was the sequence of events. Ferdinando confessed publicly before providing a formal confession to Italian prosecutors. Millions of viewers who had followed the case over the years suddenly learned that the mystery they had debated for nearly a decade had concealed an unimaginable reality. The emotional impact across Italy was immediate. For years, many had hoped the Carretta family might still be alive somewhere abroad. That possibility disappeared in a matter of moments. Yet, even after the confession, the investigation was far from complete. Confessions alone do not conclude criminal investigations. Detectives still needed to establish whether Ferdinando's statements corresponded with physical evidence. They needed to locate the victims, if possible. They needed to reconstruct events that had occurred almost a decade earlier. They needed to determine whether forensic science could recover traces that ordinary observation had. Missed in 1989, investigators returned to Parma with renewed purpose. The apartment on Via Rimini, once considered merely the last known residence of a missing family, was now treated as the suspected scene of a triple homicide. Specialists conducted careful forensic examinations using techniques unavailable or less developed during the original investigation. Meanwhile, authorities searched the Viarolo landfill after Ferdinando stated that he had disposed of the bodies there. The task was overwhelming. Years of accumulated waste had transformed the site into an immense landscape where locating 3 victims became extraordinarily difficult. Despite those efforts, no remains were recovered. The murder weapon likewise remained missing. In many criminal cases, a confession serves only to confirm evidence already collected. In the Caretta investigation, the opposite occurred. The confession became the key that finally explained evidence investigators had struggled to interpret for nearly 9 years. It revealed why the apartment had been so carefully cleaned. It explained why the camper had been abandoned in Milan. It clarified the misleading financial activity after the disappearance. It transformed years of false theories into a coherent sequence of deliberate deception. Yet it also left behind one final and enduring absence. Giuseppe Carretta, Marta Chizzi, and Nicola Caretta were finally acknowledged not as missing persons, but as murder victims. Nevertheless, despite the confession that solved the mystery of their disappearance, they themselves remained missing. Their bodies had vanished into a place where recovery proved impossible, leaving investigators with the rare challenge of proving a triple homicide in which the victims themselves could never be brought home. The investigation that had begun with questions about where an ordinary family had gone had finally uncovered its answer, but it had done so in perhaps the most unexpected way imaginable, not through the discovery of hidden evidence, but because the only surviving witness to the crime eventually chose to tell the world what had happened inside the apartment on Via Rimini almost a decade earlier. Ferdinando Carretta's confession transformed one of Italy's most enduring missing person mysteries into a homicide investigation, but did not eliminate the extraordinary challenges facing prosecutors. In many murder cases, investigators begin with a body, a crime scene, and physical evidence that gradually leads them toward a suspect. In the Caretta case, the sequence unfolded in reverse. The suspect had confessed. The victims were still missing. The murder weapon had disappeared. Nearly a decade had passed since the crimes. Time had erased much of the evidence that investigators would normally rely upon. The legal system now faced the difficult task of proving a triple homicide in which the confession itself had become one of the most significant pieces of evidence. Once Italian authorities received Ferdinando's admission, detectives immediately began verifying every aspect of his account. A confession, regardless of how detailed, cannot simply be accepted without corroboration. Investigators needed to determine whether the physical evidence that remained after almost 9 years supported what Ferdinando claimed had happened inside the apartment on Via Rimini. Their first priority was to locate the victims. According to Ferdinando's statement, after killing his father, mother, and younger brother, he had transported their bodies to the Viarolo landfill near Parma and discarded them there. That information launched one of the most difficult searches associated with the case. Landfills are constantly changing environments. Every day, enormous quantities of refuse are deposited, compressed, and buried beneath additional layers. By the time investigators returned in 1998, nearly a decade had passed since the alleged disposal of the bodies. During those years, millions of tons of waste had accumulated, even with a confession identifying the general location. Recovering 3 victims from such a vast site was an almost impossible undertaking. Authorities nevertheless searched the landfill, hoping that some trace of Giuseppe Caretta, Marta Chetsi, or Nicola Caretta might still be recovered. The search ultimately failed. No human remains belonging to the family were found. That outcome left one of the central tragedies of the case unresolved. The victims' relatives would never receive the certainty that comes from recovering the bodies of loved ones. There would be no forensic examination capable of documenting the exact injuries, no opportunity for a traditional burial, and no physical confirmation of the final moments described in Ferdinando's confession. Even after the mystery had been solved, the three members of the Caretta family remained missing in the most literal sense. Investigators also attempted to locate the Walther 6.3 5mm pistol that Ferdinando admitted purchasing before the murders. Once again, their efforts were unsuccessful. The firearm was never recovered. Without the weapon, ballistic comparisons could not be performed, and prosecutors could not present the gun itself as evidence during legal proceedings. The absence of both the bodies and the weapon made forensic work inside the apartment even more important. Specialists returned to the residence at 8 Via Rimini to conduct a detailed examination using methods capable of detecting evidence invisible during the original investigation. Although Ferdinando had spent hours cleaning the apartment after the killings, complete elimination of biological evidence proved impossible. Beneath a soap holder in the bathroom, forensic experts discovered microscopic traces of human blood. DNA analysis identified both male and female genetic material. These findings carried particular significance because they closely matched Ferdinando's own description of events. According to his confession, he had moved the bodies into the bathroom after the shootings before transporting them away. The discovery of blood beneath the bathroom fixture did not reconstruct every detail of the crime, but it strongly supported the central elements of his account. After nearly a decade, the apartment still preserved silent evidence that violence had occurred within its walls. Those forensic discoveries became essential because they demonstrated that Ferdinando's confession was not merely a collection of unverifiable statements. Instead, physical evidence, limited though it was, corresponded with his narrative. The cleaned apartment, once interpreted as the home of a family that had voluntarily disappeared, was now recognized as the location where 3 people had lost their lives. Prosecutors could therefore present a case built upon several interconnected elements: the confession, the recovered biological evidence, the financial transactions conducted after the murders, the deliberate abandonment of the family's camper in Milan, and Ferdinando's own movements following his departure from Italy. As the investigation progressed toward court proceedings, another critical issue emerged. The legal system needed to determine not only whether Ferdinando had committed the killings, but also whether he could be held criminally responsible for them under Italian law. This question required extensive psychiatric evaluation. Mental health experts examined Ferdinando in order to assess his psychological condition, paying particular attention to his state of mind at the time of the murders in August 1989. Their conclusions would ultimately shape the entire outcome of the trial. According to the psychiatric experts appointed during the proceedings, Ferdinando had been suffering from severe mental disorder when the crimes occurred. The specialists concluded that, at the time of the murders, he lacked the capacity to fully understand or control his actions. Earlier assessments had already identified distorted perceptions of family relationships, persistent feelings of being controlled and oppressed, and paranoid tendencies. During the legal process, those findings were examined in greater detail. The issue before the court was not whether the killings had occurred. Ferdinando himself had admitted responsibility, and the available evidence supported his account. Instead, the central legal question became whether his mental condition at the time of the offenses removed criminal responsibility under Italian law. This distinction often generates confusion outside the courtroom. A finding that an individual was legally incapable of understanding or controlling his actions does not mean the court concludes that no crime occurred, nor does it represent an acquittal based on innocence. Rather, it reflects a legal determination that the offender's mental state prevented the application of ordinary criminal punishment. The court still recognized Ferdinando as the person responsible for the deaths of Giuseppe Carretta, Marta Chetzi, and Nicola Carretta. What changed was the legal consequence that followed. In 1999, the judicial process reached its conclusion. Ferdinando Carretta was identified as the perpetrator of the triple homicide. At the same time, the court accepted the psychiatric evaluations, concluding that he had been unable to fully comprehend or control his behavior when the murders were committed. Consequently, he was not sentenced to a conventional prison term. Instead, the court ordered that he be confined within an ospedale psichiatrico giudiziario, a judicial psychiatric hospital designed to treat offenders whose crimes were linked to severe mental illness. The decision immediately became one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. For many members of the public, the outcome felt deeply unsettling. 3 people had died. Their bodies had never been recovered. The killer had lived freely in another country for nearly 9 years before confessing. Yet the final judicial response was not imprisonment, but compulsory psychiatric treatment. Others viewed the ruling through the framework of Italian criminal law, emphasizing that the court had followed the conclusions of independent psychiatric experts regarding Ferdinando's condition at the time of the offenses. The verdict therefore reflected not sympathy for the crimes, but the legal principles governing criminal responsibility and mental incapacity. Regardless of individual opinion, the judgment underscored the complexity of balancing justice, public safety, and medical understanding in cases involving severe psychiatric disorders. After the court's decision, Ferdinando entered the judicial psychiatric system rather than the ordinary prison system. His confinement was not intended as a traditional sentence with a fixed duration. Instead, it functioned as a security measure linked to ongoing assessments of his mental condition and his potential risk to society. Over the following years, medical professionals periodically evaluated his progress, determining whether continued hospitalization remained necessary. The legal proceedings may have established responsibility, but they did not answer every question surrounding the Carretta case. Without the victims' bodies, certain aspects of the crime could never be independently verified through forensic examination. Investigators could not reconstruct the exact trajectories of the gunshots or document injuries. Through autopsy, they could not compare ballistic evidence with the missing firearm. Some details contained in Ferdinando's confession, particularly regarding the transport and disposal of the bodies, remained impossible to confirm because no physical evidence survived. Another question also continued to provoke discussion. Ferdinando consistently stated that he had originally intended to kill only his father and had decided to shoot his mother and brother because they became witnesses. Since no independent evidence could establish his intentions before the first shot was fired, investigators could neither conclusively verify nor conclusively refute that explanation. It remained part of his confession, but one that would always exist beyond complete verification. Thus, the courtroom brought legal resolution without eliminating every mystery. The court identified the killer. It accepted that 3 murders had occurred. It imposed psychiatric confinement based upon established medical findings. Yet the case remained unusual because so many of its most important physical elements had disappeared forever. The victims remained unrecovered. The murder weapon remained missing. The apartment, cleaned almost immediately after the crime, preserved only microscopic traces of the violence that had unfolded there. In many criminal cases, a verdict marks the end of uncertainty. In the Carretta investigation, it marked something different. It provided answers to the central question of who was responsible. while leaving behind enduring absences that no legal judgment could fill. Justice had spoken according to the law, but the silence surrounding the missing victims continued, reminding everyone that even when a case is legally resolved, some losses can never be fully recovered. The legal proceedings concluded the formal chapter of the Coretta case, but they did not bring an immediate end to the story. Court judgments can determine responsibility, psychiatric evaluations can establish legal capacity, and investigators can close their files. Yet the consequences of a crime often continue unfolding long after the final hearing. In the years following the verdict, Ferdinando Coretta remained under the supervision of Italy's judicial psychiatric system, while the families connected to the victims continued living with an absence that could never be fully resolved. Unlike cases in which victims are recovered and laid to rest, the Coretta family remained suspended between certainty and loss. Their deaths had been acknowledged by the courts, but their remains had never been returned. For Giuseppe Coretta, Marta Chetzi, and Nicola Coretta, there would be no graves confirmed by forensic recovery, no final opportunity for relatives to say goodbye before burial, and no physical place that represented the end of their journey. Their disappearance had been explained, yet in another sense it had never truly ended. The judicial psychiatric measures imposed on Ferdinando reflected the conclusions reached during the trial rather than a conventional criminal sentence, because the court accepted that he had been incapable of fully understanding or controlling his actions at the time of the murders. His confinement focused on treatment and public safety instead of ordinary imprisonment. His future, therefore, depended upon continuing psychiatric assessments rather than the completion of a fixed prison term. Over time, those evaluations suggested gradual improvement. In 2004, approximately 5 years after the court's decision, Ferdinando was granted semi-liberty, marking the first significant step toward reintegration. Such measures are carefully structured within the Italian legal system, balancing continued supervision with increasing personal responsibility. They reflected the conclusion of medical specialists that his condition had changed sufficiently to permit limited freedom while maintaining oversight. 2 years later, in 2006, another transition followed. Ferdinando moved from the Judicial Psychiatric Hospital to a rehabilitation community in Forlì. This change represented another stage in his treatment, rather than a declaration that the events of 1989 had somehow been forgotten or erased. Rehabilitation communities are intended to support individuals as they adapt to life outside institutional settings while still receiving structured assistance. Even after legal proceedings have ended, mental health treatment often continues through gradual stages rather than abrupt release. By 2009, Ferdinando left the treatment facility altogether, having progressed through the successive phases established by the psychiatric and judicial authorities. His life increasingly resembled that of an ordinary private citizen, although his name remained permanently associated with one of Italy's most discussed criminal cases. Public attention did not disappear simply because legal supervision diminished. For many Italians, the memory of the Coretta case remained vivid, particularly because so many aspects of the crime continued to provoke debate. In 2010, another symbolic event attracted attention. Ferdinando sold the apartment where the murders had occurred. The residence at 8 Via Rimini had become inseparable from the history of the crime. It was the place where 3 lives ended and where investigators, years later, discovered microscopic traces of blood beneath the bathroom soap holder that supported the confession. Selling the apartment marked the closing of one physical chapter. Yet it also reminded the public that buildings outlive the tragedies that occur inside them. Walls can be repainted, rooms can be renovated, new occupants may eventually arrive. But history remains attached to certain places in ways that architecture alone cannot erase. 5 years later, In 2015, Ferdinando Carreta was officially declared fully free after authorities concluded that he no longer represented a danger to society. Legally, the process that had begun with his confinement in a judicial psychiatric hospital had reached its conclusion. Medically and legally, professionals responsible for evaluating his condition determined that continued restrictions were no longer necessary. Yet public reaction remained deeply divided. For some observers, the decision reflected the principles upon which the psychiatric ruling had always been based. If the purpose of the security measure was treatment rather than punishment, and if experts concluded that treatment had succeeded, then release followed the logic of the legal framework established years earlier. Others viewed the outcome very differently. They focused not on psychiatric recovery, but on the irreversible consequences suffered by the victims. 3 members of one family had died. None of their bodies had ever been found. The murder weapon remained missing. The man who admitted responsibility had spent almost 9 years living freely in another country. Before confessing, against that background, complete freedom appeared difficult for many members of the public to accept. Perhaps no issue generated stronger public criticism than the question of inheritance. Following subsequent civil arrangements involving Ferdinando's aunts, he ultimately received inheritance rights connected to the very family whose deaths he had admitted causing. Legally, the matter was resolved through civil agreement. But emotionally, it proved far more complicated. Many people found it profoundly disturbing that the only surviving member of the Carreta household and the admitted killer would also become the beneficiary of family property. Critics argued that the situation violated common ideas of justice, even if it complied with the applicable legal procedures. Supporters of the legal process pointed out that the outcome reflected civil law and the particular circumstances of the family's estate rather than a reward for criminal conduct. Nevertheless, the controversy reinforced how the Carreta case repeatedly challenged ordinary expectations about crime, punishment, and justice. Another source of continuing debate involved the victims themselves. Because no remains had ever been recovered, the exact forensic reconstruction of the murders remained incomplete. Ferdinando's confession described the shootings, the movement of the bodies into the bathroom, and their disposal at the Villarolo landfill. The blood traces discovered beneath the bathroom fixture supported important portions of that account. Yet the absence of the bodies meant investigators could never conduct autopsies to independently establish the precise causes of death or verify every aspect of the confession. Likewise, the Walther 6.35mm pistol that Ferdinando admitted purchasing and using was never found. Without the firearm, ballistic analysis could not contribute additional certainty. Consequently, certain details of the crime will probably remain beyond complete verification forever. Historians, legal scholars, and criminologists continue examining those unresolved questions, not because they alter the central conclusion of the investigation, but because they illustrate the limitations investigators sometimes face even after a confession has been obtained. Another unresolved point concerns Ferdinando's stated intention before the murders. Throughout the proceedings, he maintained that his original plan had been to kill only his father and that he decided to shoot his mother and brother because they had become witnesses. Since no surviving evidence can conclusively establish his state of mind before the first shot, this explanation remains impossible to prove or disprove completely. It survives as part of the historical record through his own words, but not through independent confirmation. Such uncertainties are common in cases where the only surviving participant is also the perpetrator. The legal system may establish responsibility beyond reasonable doubt while still acknowledging that certain psychological details remain unknowable. On June 1, 2023, another chapter quietly came to an end. Ferdinando Carreta was found dead in his home in Forli at the age of 61. According to publicly released information, he had been ill for some time before his death. His passing closed the final living connection to the events inside the apartment on Via Rimini in August 1989. With his death, no direct participant in the crime remained alive to answer the questions that continue surrounding the case. Whatever details were never revealed during his confession or later testimony are now likely to remain unknown forever. Yet the significance of the Caretta case extends far beyond the life of the man who confessed. It occupies a unique place in Italian criminal history because it combines several extraordinarily rare elements. For nearly a decade, an entire family was believed to have disappeared voluntarily or fallen victim to circumstances that investigators could not identify. Numerous theories diverted attention toward international travel, financial escape, or organized crime. A nationally recognized television program devoted years to searching for answers, helping keep the investigation alive when many other disappearances might have faded from public memory. Then, unexpectedly, the mystery was solved not through the discovery of a hidden grave or the recovery of decisive forensic evidence, but because the perpetrator voluntarily admitted everything during a televised interview before formally confessing to prosecutors. Even after that extraordinary admission, the investigation retained many of its original mysteries. The bodies were never recovered. The murder weapon never resurfaced. The apartment yielded only microscopic biological traces after years had passed. The legal outcome depended heavily upon psychiatric evaluations establishing Ferdinando's mental state at the time of the offenses, producing a verdict that many citizens accepted as legally justified while others regarded as morally unsatisfying. Few criminal cases combine so many unusual characteristics within a single narrative. Beyond its legal and investigative significance, however, the Caretta case ultimately remains a human story. Giuseppe Caretta was remembered as a careful accountant devoted to structure and responsibility. Marta Chetzi spent her life caring for her family and home. Nicola Caretta had struggled with addiction but was trying to rebuild his future. Their individual lives often become overshadowed by the mystery surrounding their disappearance and the extraordinary confession that finally explained it. Yet behind every headline, every court document, and every television broadcast were three people whose lives ended inside the place where they should have been safest. Their absence became the defining feature of the investigation because it forced police, journalists, and the public to search for answers without the evidence that homicide investigations usually depend upon. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Caretta case is that truth does not always emerge through dramatic forensic breakthroughs. Sometimes it remains hidden behind carefully constructed deception, strengthened by the simple fact that investigators naturally follow the evidence available to them, when the evidence itself has been deliberately manipulated. Even experienced detectives can spend years pursuing reasonable theories that ultimately prove incorrect. The Caretta investigation demonstrates both the remarkable persistence required in long-term missing person inquiries and the humility demanded by complex criminal investigations. It reminds us that certainty should never be confused with assumption, and that unanswered questions sometimes survive even after a case has been legally resolved. More than 3 decades after the murders, the apartment has changed owners. The legal proceedings have ended, the man responsible has died, and countless newspaper pages have been archived. Yet somewhere beneath the accumulated layers of history surrounding the Viarolo landfill lies a possibility that has never entirely disappeared. The hope that one day, however unlikely it may seem, the missing members of the Caretta family might finally be found. Until then, their story remains one of Italy's most haunting criminal cases, a tragedy defined not only by the violence that ended 3 lives, but also by the extraordinary silence that concealed the truth for nearly 9 years before it emerged in the most unexpected way imaginable. Nearly 3.5 decades after the events of August 1989, the case of Ferdinando Corretta remains one of the most disturbing and unforgettable criminal stories in modern Italian history. It is a case that began not with a discovered crime scene, but with an absence. A family disappeared. A home was left behind. A vehicle was found abandoned. A country searched for answers while the truth remained hidden in plain sight. For almost 9 years, Italy believed it was facing a mysterious disappearance. Investigators followed possibilities that seemed reasonable based on the evidence available at the time. They considered voluntary escape, financial problems, international relocation, and even criminal involvement. Every theory emerged from the same fundamental problem. There was no clear evidence that a murder had occurred. There were no bodies. There was no weapon. There was no surviving witness who could explain what happened inside the apartment at 8 Via Rimini. The reality, revealed only years later, was far more tragic. The Corretta family had not disappeared together. They had not begun a new life abroad. They had not escaped from their old existence. According to the confession of Ferdinando Corretta, their lives ended inside their own home, in the place where they should have been protected. The story of Giuseppe Corretta, Marta Cezzi, and Nicola Corretta is ultimately not only a story about crime. It is a story about 3 people whose identities were almost consumed by the mystery surrounding their deaths. Over the years, newspaper articles, television programs, and public discussions naturally focused on the unusual aspects of the investigation. The missing family, the false trail, the confession, and the legal outcome. But behind those elements were 3 individuals who had ordinary lives before becoming victims of an extraordinary tragedy. Giuseppe Corretta was a working man who spent his career as an accountant for a glass manufacturing company. Marta Cezzi was a mother and homemaker whose life revolved around her family. Nicola Corretta was a young man who had faced personal difficulties and was attempting to rebuild stability after his struggle with drug addiction. Their lives were not defined by the crime committed against them. They were defined by the years that existed before that moment, by their relationships, their routines, and the people who knew them. Yet because their bodies were never recovered, even the most basic human rituals surrounding death were denied to them and to their relatives. There was no confirmed burial site, no physical place where loved ones could stand and say goodbye, no final act of returning them home. Their absence remained permanent. This element of the case continues to be one of its most painful aspects. A confession solved the mystery of what happened, but it could not restore what had been lost. It could not return the victims. It could not erase the years during which families and investigators searched for answers. It could not replace the certainty that comes from recovering those who have disappeared. In that sense, the Corretta case demonstrates that solving a crime and healing from a crime are 2 different processes. One may be achieved through investigation and legal judgment. The other may remain incomplete forever. The investigation itself also became a lesson in the difficulties of missing person cases. When someone disappears, investigators must work with the evidence that remains. In the Corretta case, the evidence initially suggested a family that had chosen to leave. The abandoned camper in Milan appeared to support the idea that the family had traveled. The lack of visible violence inside the apartment reinforced the assumption that there had been no crime. Financial activity after the disappearance created additional confusion. These details were not meaningless or ignored by investigators. They were interpreted according to the information available at the time. The problem was that the most important evidence had been deliberately hidden. The apartment had been cleaned. The bodies had been removed. The weapon had disappeared. The person responsible had left the country. The investigation therefore developed around an incomplete picture, and that incomplete picture shaped nearly a decade of searching. When the truth finally emerged in 1998, it did so in a way few people could have predicted. There was no dramatic discovery of hidden remains. There was no unexpected confession letter. There was no final piece of forensic evidence that suddenly solved everything. Instead, the man who had remained silent for years sat before television cameras and revealed what had happened. The confession during the interview with Chi Elhavisto became one of the defining moments of the case. For viewers who had followed the disappearance for years, the revelation represented the sudden collapse of a long-held belief. A family thought to be missing had become a family recognized as murdered. The search for the living became a search for truth about the dead. The role of Chi Elhavisto also became closely connected with the history of the case. The program had repeatedly brought attention to the Coretta disappearance, helping maintain public awareness when many mysteries gradually fade from attention. The discovery of the camper after a viewer's report demonstrated the unusual role that public participation can play in investigations involving missing persons. Years later, the same program became the place where the mystery reached its shocking turning point. The relationship between media and criminal investigations is often complicated, but in the Coretta case, television became part of both the search for answers and the moment when those answers finally emerged. The legal conclusion of the case remains one of its most debated elements. The court recognized Ferdinando Coretta as responsible for the deaths of his family members, but psychiatric evaluations determined that he lacked the capacity to fully understand and control his actions at the time of the murders. As a result, he was placed in a judicial psychiatric hospital rather than receiving a conventional prison sentence. This outcome generated strong reactions throughout Italy. Some saw it as a necessary application of legal principles regarding mental illness and criminal responsibility. Others struggled with the idea that a man who had admitted killing 3 members of his own family would eventually regain freedom. The controversy surrounding his release reflected a broader social debate that extends beyond this single case. How should society respond when a person commits an extreme act of violence while experiencing severe psychiatric illness? The Coretta case did not provide an easy answer. Instead, it forced the public to confront the tension between justice, punishment, treatment, and public safety. The years after the trial also demonstrated that legal resolution does not always end public discussion. Ferdinando's gradual movement through the psychiatric system, his eventual freedom, and the later controversy regarding inheritance rights all renewed debate about the meaning of justice. For many people, the emotional weight of the murders remains stronger than any legal explanation. They remembered 3 victims who never came home and questioned how the person responsible could eventually return to ordinary life. Others emphasized that the legal system had followed the conclusions of psychiatric experts and that rehabilitation was a central principle of the measures imposed. Both reactions reflected different ways of understanding the same painful reality. The case contained not only facts and evidence, but also profound moral questions that continue to divide public opinion. When Ferdinando Coretta died on June 1st, 2023, at the age of 61, another chapter of the story ended. According to available information, he had suffered from illness for some time before his death. With his passing, the last person directly connected to the crime was gone. No further confession would come. No new explanation would emerge. No additional details about the missing weapon or the location of the victim's remains could be provided by him. The unanswered questions surrounding the case became permanent. Yet the end of Ferdinando Coretta's life did not erase the significance of the 3 lives taken in 1989. If anything, it reinforced the importance of remembering the victims separately from the person who committed the crime. In many famous criminal cases, public attention naturally follows the offender. The investigation, the trial, the psychological evaluations, and the controversies surrounding punishment often become the dominant narrative. But behind those elements are always people whose lives were interrupted. The Coretta case should ultimately be remembered as the story of a family that was destroyed and of 3 individuals who deserve to be more than names attached to a crime file. More than 30 years later, the mystery that once surrounded the disappearance of the Coretta family has been solved in its essential form. The world knows what happened. It knows who was responsible. It knows how the deception was created and how the truth finally emerged. Yet some mysteries remain untouched by any investigation. The exact location of the victim's remains is still unknown. The murder weapon has never been recovered. Certain psychological details surrounding the events inside the apartment will never be fully understood. These unanswered questions do not change the established facts of the case, but they serve as reminders that even the most thoroughly examined crimes can leave behind shadows. The story of Ferdinando Coretta remains powerful because it combines several elements rarely found together. A family disappearance that remained unsolved for years, a carefully constructed false narrative, a confession delivered unexpectedly in front of cameras, a trial shaped by psychiatric evaluation, and victims whose final resting place remains unknown. But beyond all of those elements lies a simpler and more important truth. On August 4th, 1989, 3 people lost their lives. Giuseppe Coretta, Marta Chetsi, and Nicola Coretta were not characters in a mystery. They were a father, a mother, and a son. They had histories, relationships, and futures that ended abruptly. Their story continues because people continue searching for meaning in what happened. But any reflection on the case must begin and end with the human cost. The apartment on Via Rimini is no longer the center of a police investigation. The court proceedings are finished. The headlines have faded with time. But the memory of the Coretta family remains connected to one of Italy's most haunting criminal cases, not because the mystery lasted so long, but because behind that mystery were 3 lives that deserve to be remembered. The case of Ferdinando Coretta occupies a unique and uncomfortable place in Italy's criminal history because it challenges the way people usually understand the idea of closure. In many investigations, closure arrives when the truth is discovered, when the offender is identified, when evidence confirms what happened, and when the legal system reaches a conclusion. The Coretta case achieved all of those things. The identity of the person responsible was known. The sequence of events was reconstructed through confession and forensic findings. The court reached its decision. Yet despite all of this, something fundamental remained unfinished. 3 people were still absent. Their final resting place remained unknown. Their families never received the certainty of recovering their remains. The truth had emerged, but a part of the tragedy remained hidden. For nearly 9 years, the Coretta family existed in the public imagination as a question. Where had Giuseppe, Marta, Nicola, and Ferdinando gone? Were they living somewhere far away? Had they escaped their previous lives? Had they started again in another country? Those questions shaped public discussion throughout the 1990s. People searched for explanations because the alternative was almost impossible to imagine. The possibility that an entire family had been destroyed inside their own home was concealed behind a carefully constructed illusion. The disappearance appeared to tell one story. The truth told another. This contrast is what made the case so disturbing. The apartment at 8 Via Rimini did not immediately reveal the violence that had occurred there. To investigators arriving in 1989, it was the last known home of a missing family, not an obvious crime scene. The absence of visible evidence created uncertainty. The missing bodies removed the most direct confirmation that a homicide had taken place. The abandoned camper in Milan suggested movement rather than death. The financial activity after the disappearance suggested that someone connected to the family was still managing their affairs. Each piece of information seemed to point toward disappearance rather than murder. Only later did investigators understand that those same details had been part of the deception. The Coretta case demonstrates how difficult criminal investigations become when the physical evidence has been intentionally removed. Investigators are often taught to follow evidence wherever it leads. But in this case, the evidence itself had been manipulated. The absence of signs inside the apartment became a misleading sign. The missing vehicle became a false clue. The lack of bodies became the reason the truth remained hidden. For the investigators who worked on the case, the eventual confession must have represented both an answer and a reminder of how much had remained unknown. After years of exploring possibilities across different countries and considering countless theories, they finally received the information that connected all the unanswered questions. The confession explained why the family had disappeared. It explained why the apartment had appeared normal. It explained why the camper had been found abandoned. It explained why the search for a missing family had continued for so long. But even the confession had limits. The words of the perpetrator could describe events, but they could not restore physical evidence that was gone forever. The bodies of Giuseppe, Marta, and Nicola remained unrecovered despite searches of the Viarolo landfill. The Walther pistol that Ferdinando said he used was never found. Without those elements, certain parts of the investigation could never reach the level of certainty that investigators normally seek. This does not erase the conclusions reached by the authorities. The confession, combined with the forensic evidence discovered in the apartment and the circumstances surrounding the disappearance, established the responsibility of Ferdinando Coretta. But it highlights an important reality of criminal investigations. Knowing what happened and proving every detail of how it happened are not always the same thing. The absence of the victims also affected the emotional dimension of the case. For many families of homicide victims, the recovery of a body represents a painful but meaningful moment. It allows mourning to take a physical form. It provides a place where memories can be gathered and where the person who was lost can finally be honored. The Coretta family was denied that moment. Giuseppe, Marta, and Nicola became victims without a final physical return. Their names remained connected to a crime that received enormous public attention. But their own lives risked being overshadowed by the actions of the person who killed them. This is one of the most difficult challenges in stories involving notorious crimes. Public attention naturally focuses on the offender, their motives, their behavior, their trial, and their punishment. Yet the center of the story should always remain with those whose lives were taken. Giuseppe was not only the father in a criminal case. He was a person who worked, maintained responsibilities, and built a family life. Marta was not simply described by her role as a victim. She was a mother who spent years caring for her household. Nicola was not defined only by his struggles with addiction. He was a young man attempting to move forward and rebuild his life. Remembering victims as complete human beings is one of the most important ways to prevent crime. Stories from becoming only stories about criminals. The later years of the case also raised difficult questions about the relationship between justice and mental illness. The court's decision regarding Ferdinando Coretta remained controversial because it challenged common expectations about punishment. Many people believe that a person responsible for killing 3 family members should face a traditional prison sentence. Others emphasize that the legal system had a responsibility to consider the psychiatric evaluations presented during the trial. The case, therefore, became part of a larger discussion about criminal responsibility. When someone commits an act of extreme violence while experiencing severe mental illness, how should society respond? Should punishment be the primary focus? Should treatment and prevention guide the response? How should the rights of victims and the safety of society be balanced with medical conclusions? about an offender's condition? The Coretta case did not provide simple answers. Instead, it exposed the complexity of those questions. The controversy continued even after Ferdinando's release from psychiatric supervision. His return to ordinary life, the sale of the apartment where the murders occurred, and the inheritance issue involving his family's property all generated renewed public reaction. For many people, the emotional reality of the crime remained impossible to separate from the legal reasoning behind the decisions. The idea that the person responsible could eventually live outside institutional control and benefit from family inheritance created anger and disbelief. At the same time, the legal system operated according to its own principles. The psychiatric measures imposed after the trial were not designed as permanent punishment, but as security measures connected to treatment and risk assessment. Once professionals determined that he was no longer considered dangerous, the restrictions were gradually removed. This difference between legal resolution and emotional acceptance became one of the defining themes of the case. A court can determine responsibility. It can apply the law. It can establish consequences according to legal standards. But it cannot control how society feels about a tragedy, especially one involving the destruction of an entire family. The death of Ferdinando Coretta in 2023 brought the final chapter of the case to a close in another way. The person who had carried the only complete account of the crime was gone. Whatever thoughts, memories, or details he had not shared disappeared with him. The remaining unanswered questions became permanent. Yet the significance of the case does not depend on those unanswered questions alone. Its importance comes from what it revealed about investigations, families, justice, and memory. The Coretta case remains a warning about how appearances can deceive. A normal-looking home can hide unimaginable violence. A disappearance can sometimes conceal a crime. A person can live openly for years while carrying the secret of an event that devastated an entire family. And an investigation can continue for years before the truth finally emerges. But it is also a reminder of persistence. Investigators continued searching despite years of uncertainty. Journalists continued reporting despite the lack of answers. The public continued hoping that the missing family might one day be found. The case remained alive because people refused to accept that unanswered questions should simply disappear. Ultimately, the story of Ferdinando Coretta is not remembered because of the sophistication of the crime or because of the attention given to the person responsible. It remains remembered because it represents one of the most painful forms of loss, a family erased, a truth hidden, and a search that ended without the recovery of those who were lost. More than 30 years later, the names Giuseppe Coretta, Marta Cezzi, and Nicola Coretta remain linked to one of Italy's most famous criminal investigations. Their story began as a disappearance and ended as a confirmed tragedy. But beyond the investigation, beyond the courtroom, and beyond the debates that followed, their lives deserve to be remembered for what they were before the crime occurred. They were a father, a mother, and a son. They were people with histories, relationships, and ordinary moments that existed before they became part of a national mystery. The final unanswered question of the Coretta case is not only where the victims are, it is also how their memory should be preserved. The answer must begin by looking beyond the crime itself. Because every investigation eventually ends. Every trial eventually concludes. Every headline eventually fades. But the responsibility to remember those who were lost remains. The story of Ferdinando Coretta did not end with a confession, a verdict, or even with the death of the man responsible. Some criminal cases disappear from public memory once the legal process concludes. But others continue to exist because they raise questions that extend beyond the crime itself. The Coretta case belongs to the second category. It remains remembered not only because of the violence that occurred inside a family home in Parma, but because of the extraordinary path through which the truth emerged, and because of the unresolved elements that still surround the tragedy. It was a case about disappearance, deception, investigation, mental health, and the difficult search for justice when some answers remain permanently out of reach. For many years, the central image associated with the Coretta family was not death, but absence. Italy did not initially know that Giuseppe, Marta, and Nicola were victims of a homicide. The country knew only that a family had vanished. That uncertainty shaped the emotional response to the case. When people heard about the disappearance, many imagined possibilities that still allowed for hope. Perhaps the family had chosen to leave. Perhaps they had started a new life somewhere far away. Perhaps there was an explanation that would eventually bring them back. That hope lasted because there was no immediate evidence forcing people to confront a darker reality. The human mind naturally searches for explanations when faced with uncertainty. A missing person creates an open story, one where different endings remain possible. A murder closes that story in the most painful way. In the Coretta case, the truth remained hidden because the evidence did not initially reveal the tragedy that had already occurred. The absence of bodies created an illusion of possibility. The missing family seemed to be somewhere waiting to be found. The revelation in 1998 destroyed that illusion. When Ferdinando Coretta confessed during the television interview with Chi El Havisto, the public experienced a sudden transformation of the entire case. Years of speculation collapsed instantly. The theories about foreign countries, voluntary disappearance, and unknown dangers were replaced by the reality that the disappearance had been created from within the family itself. The confession was shocking not only because of its content, but because of the calm manner in which it was delivered. After almost a decade of silence, the person who held the answer had been living openly in London, using his own name, while investigators searched for explanations elsewhere. The contrast between the scale of the mystery and the simplicity of his existence abroad became one of the most striking elements of the case. There was no hidden identity, no elaborate escape plan, no dramatic attempt to disappear completely. Instead, the man at the center of the mystery had remained visible. This detail continues to fascinate investigators and observers because it demonstrates that criminals do not always behave according to the expectations created by public imagination. People often imagine that someone responsible for a serious crime must constantly hide, change identity, or live under extraordinary circumstances. The Coretta case showed a different reality. Sometimes the person connected to the crime may exist in ordinary surroundings, separated from the investigation not by distance alone, but by the assumptions guiding the search. The case also became an important example of the difficulties surrounding missing person investigations. Before the confession, investigators had to work with incomplete information. Every decision was based on the evidence available at the time. The family's apartment did not immediately reveal the violence that had occurred there. The camper found in Milan suggested travel. The financial activity after the disappearance suggested continued movement. Each detail appeared meaningful, but the interpretation was shaped by the absence of critical information. Only later did investigators understand that the disappearance itself had been constructed. This is one of the reasons the Coretta case continues to be studied. It demonstrates how a false narrative can become powerful when supported by circumstances that appear logical. Investigators were not ignoring obvious answers. They were following the information before them. The difficulty was that the most important fact, the deaths of the victims, had been concealed. The forensic discoveries after the confession provided a connection between the words of Ferdinando and the physical reality of the apartment. The traces of male and female blood discovered beneath the soap holder in the bathroom became a silent confirmation that the apartment had witnessed violence. After years of uncertainty, the location that had once represented a mystery became recognized as the place where the crime had occurred. Yet, even this evidence had limits. The Coretta case will always remain unusual because the investigation reached a conclusion without recovering the victims. In most homicide investigations, the discovery of remains provides not only evidence, but also emotional resolution. It allows investigators to confirm details and allows families to perform final rituals of mourning. In this case, those possibilities remained unavailable. The Villa Rollo landfill became the symbolic location of one of the greatest unanswered questions in the investigation. According to Ferdinando's confession, it was where the bodies had been taken after the murders. Authorities searched the area, but the remains of Giuseppe, Marta, and Nicola were never found. Their absence became one of the defining characteristics of the case. For investigators, this meant that some details could never be confirmed through traditional forensic methods. There could be no autopsy reports establishing the precise injuries. There could be no examination of the firearm. There could be no final physical reconstruction of the crime. Instead, the case depended on the combination of confession, forensic traces, and surrounding circumstances. For the victims' relatives, however, the meaning was much more personal. The missing bodies represented an ongoing wound. A person can understand intellectually that someone has died while still experiencing the emotional difficulty of never seeing them returned. The Coretta family's disappearance therefore continued in another form even after the truth became known. The legal outcome added another layer of complexity. The court's decision regarding Ferdinando's mental condition at the time of the murders became one of the most debated aspects of the case. The psychiatric evaluations concluded that he had not possessed full capacity to understand and control his actions during the crime. This finding shaped the entire judicial response. The result was not a traditional prison sentence, but placement in a judicial psychiatric hospital. For some, this represented a necessary application of legal principles. A justice system must consider not only what happened, but also the mental state of the person responsible. If severe mental illness prevents an individual from understanding the nature of their actions, the law may respond through treatment and security measures rather than conventional punishment. For others, especially those focused on the suffering of the victims, the decision remained difficult to accept emotionally. The idea that the person responsible for destroying a family could eventually leave institutional care and return to society created feelings of anger and disbelief. This disagreement was not unique to the Coretta case. It reflected a broader question faced by many societies. How should justice respond when extreme violence and severe mental illness exist together? The case did not provide a simple answer because reality rarely provides simple answers. It showed that justice can involve competing values that are difficult to reconcile. The protection of society, the treatment of mental illness, the rights of victims, and the desire for punishment all exist within the same conversation. Years after the trial, the controversy continued through discussions about Ferdinando's freedom and inheritance. These issues became especially sensitive because they involved not only legal principles, but also emotions surrounding family betrayal and loss. For many observers, the idea that Ferdinando could have any connection to the family's remaining property felt deeply disturbing. It seemed to conflict with basic expectations of fairness. However, the legal system approached these matters through established procedures rather than public emotion. The difference between legal decisions and emotional reactions became another lasting feature of the case. The law may reach a conclusion, but society may continue debating whether that conclusion feels acceptable. This is why the Coretta case remained present in Italian public memory long after the courtroom proceedings ended. It was not only a story about what happened in 1989. It was a story about how people understand responsibility, punishment, forgiveness, and memory. The case also demonstrated the lasting influence of investigative journalism. Chi l'ha visto became inseparable from the public history of the disappearance. The program helped maintain attention on the missing family and later became the setting where the truth was revealed. The case showed the unusual relationship between media and criminal investigations. Television can sometimes become not only a platform for information, but also part of the process through which mysteries are solved. At the same time, the Coretta case serves as a reminder of the importance of approaching true crime stories responsibly. The details of a crime may attract public attention, but the victims should never become secondary figures in their own tragedy. The fascination surrounding the offender, the investigation, and the legal debate must always be balanced with remembrance of those who lost their lives. Giuseppe Carretta, Marta Chezzi, and Nicola Coretta should not be remembered only because of the way they died. They should be remembered because they lived. They had a family history. They had relationships. They had ordinary experiences that existed before the crime, transformed their names into part of a national investigation. The most respectful conclusion to their story is not found in the mystery surrounding their disappearance, nor in the controversy surrounding the person responsible. It is found in recognizing their humanity. The Coretta case remains unresolved in one important sense. The truth of what happened is known, but the full restoration of what was lost is impossible. The victims have not been recovered. The missing weapon has never been found. Certain details remain beyond confirmation. Time has removed opportunities that can never return. Yet memory remains. More than 30 years later, the case continues to represent one of Italy's most haunting criminal stories because it reveals how fragile the boundary can be between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy. A family home became a crime scene. A disappearance became a murder investigation. A missing person mystery became a national symbol of unanswered questions. And beneath all of those elements remains the simplest and most important fact. 3 people lost their lives. The legacy of the Coretta case is therefore not only about the person who committed the crime. It is about the investigation that searched for answers, the society that struggled to understand the outcome, and the victims whose names must continue to be remembered. Because even when a case is closed, the responsibility to remember never ends.